It is the most primal instinct, a command inscribed in every cell of life. It is the drive that drives the beast of prey and sows the seed in the farmer. For most of us, it is a familiar companion, a whisper that can be soothed with a meal. But what happens when that whisper turns into a roar that never ends? What happens when hunger becomes not a need, but an identity, a curse? What happens when it becomes a bottomless abyss that dwells within a person, devouring everything in its path: food, morality, and ultimately humanity itself? To answer that question, we must go back to France in the late 18th century, a society seething on the brink of the revolution. Amidst injustice and poverty, in a countryside near Lyon, a creature was born around 1772. History does not tell us his birth name. It calls him by only one name, a name that will forever be recorded in the pages of the most bizarre medical literature: Tarrare. Even as a teenager, Tarrare was an anomaly. He was a slight, gaunt man, but that was about as normal as it got. His appearance was marked by something otherworldly. His hair was unusually thin and soft, but his mouth was unnaturally wide. Doctors later recorded that when he opened his mouth, a space the size of 12 eggs could be seen without distorting his face. His lips were almost non-existent, revealing teeth that were badly yellowed and damaged from constant grinding. When he wasn't eating, his body was a bizarre sight. His skin was unusually loose, especially around his belly. He could pull the excess skin from his belly and wrap it around his waist. But when he was full, that belly would swell up like a giant, inflated balloon. And then there was the smell. Medical text by Baron Dominique Ginlary, one of the greatest surgeons of Napoleon's time, described Tarrare as emitting a stench so strong that it was unbearable within 20 paces. The smell, it was said, could be seen as a vapor rising from his body after every meal. He sweated constantly, his body always in a state of heat. But all those physical abnormalities were nothing compared to his hunger. It was not the hunger of a normal person. It was an abyss. As a teenager, Tarrare could eat a quarter of a cow in a single day, a mass of meat equal to his own weight. His family, poor peasants, could not sustain such a hunger. They did the only thing they could. They sent him away. Rejected by the first society he knew, his family, Tarrare began a life of wandering. He wandered France, following pilgrims, thieves, and prostitutes, doing anything to fill his belly. He scavenged through garbage dumps, fought with wild animals for food, and quickly realized that his deformity, his suffering, could also be a means of survival. He began performing. He became a monster for entertainment. It was the last refuge for society's outcasts. A bearded woman conjoined twins, and now a young man with a demonic hunger. Tarrare had found his new family. He joined a traveling circus, working under the tutelage of a quack, a drug dealer, and a trickster. Tarrare's role was simple. He was a human trash can. To attract the crowd's attention, the quack would challenge them to throw anything at Tarrare, and he would swallow it. At first, it was harmless stuff. A basket full of apples, which he ate in a few minutes, or dozens of raw eggs. The crowd laughed and applauded. But human curiosity has a dark side. They want to see more. They want to see boundaries broken. And Tarrare, in exchange for a piece of bread or a few coins, was willing to oblige. He began to swallow the inedible. Corks, pebbles, keys, even a pocket watch, all disappeared in his wide mouth, and then came out almost intact. His performance was an open challenge to nature, a slow self-destruction for fun. During this period, Tarrare learned an important and bitter lesson. The disgust of others was his ticket to his next meal. The horror in their eyes was his guarantee of survival. He turned his curse into a profession, a twisted performance art. But his stomach demanded more than stones. His hunger was for flesh and blood, and his performance quickly escalated to a new level of horror. Historical accounts detail the scene that became legendary about Tarrare. Surrounded by a curious crowd, he was presented with a live cat. Picture the scene. Tarrare, eyes wild and empty, seizes the screaming animal. He does not kill it first. He sinks his yellow teeth into its belly, ripping away at its skin and muscle. then begins to drink its blood greedily. The crowd falls silent, their initial delight turning to mute horror. Tarare continues to eat, tearing off bits of raw flesh until only the white bones remain. After a while, between spasms of his body, he regurgitates the fur and skin of the unfortunate animal. He did the same with puppies, snakes, and eels. His performance was no longer a spectacle. It had become a sacrilegious ritual, a display of the most naked animal instincts in the heart of civilized society. He had become the very embodiment of fear, the very thing people wanted to look at and yet turn away from. But even the world of traveling circuses could not contain him for long. His hunger was too great, his behavior too unpredictable. He became a burden. Once again, he was abandoned, wandering alone. And then history knocked. The drums of the French Revolution beat across the land. Liberty, equality, fraternity became the slogan of the age. A new social order was established on the ashes of the old regime. In that upheaval, thousands of young men joined the Revolutionary Army, some out of ideology, some because they had nowhere else to go. Tarare was one of them. A man shaped by the chaos of the streets would now enter the organized chaos of war. A new, more brutal stage awaited him. The French Revolutionary Army relied on discipline, patriotism, and strictly regulated rations. Tarare had none of these, especially the last. To a war machine that needed uniformity and efficiency, he was a faulty cog, an incalculable variable. His hunger made no distinction between friend and foe, did not follow orders, and he immediately became a threat to the order of an entire regiment. His daily rations, though quadrupled compared to that of a normal soldier, were like a pebble thrown into an abyss. Hunger tormented him relentlessly. Tarare became a ghost who roamed the barracks, doing odd jobs for other soldiers in exchange for a piece of bread or a portion of their food. When that was not enough, his most naked survival instincts kicked in. He began rummaging through the garbage, eating whatever others had thrown away. Records show that he ate rotten vegetables and rotten meat. But the height of his despair came when he was caught eating used bandages, cloth soaked in blood and pus, taken from the wounds of wounded soldiers. He even fought with wild dogs and rats in the sewers for food. His body, despite its extraordinary digestive powers, could not tolerate such a diet. He collapsed and was taken to the military hospital in Sault-Sainte-Reine. And it was here, in the controlled environment of a medical facility, that Tarare's deformity ceased to be a burden. It became a phenomenon. He caught the eye of two of the most brilliant medical minds of the time, Dr. Corville and Baron Dominique Jean Larry, who was later named by Napoleon himself as the most virtuous soldier I have ever known. They didn't see a despicable glutton. They saw a window into the deepest secrets of human physiology. They decided to make Tarare their primary subject. A series of experiments were conducted to determine his limits. The most famous, and the first, involved preparing a meal for 15 Masons. Picture the scene in a hospital room. A large table was set with 2 giant meat pies, plates of lard and salt, and 2 large pails of milk. 15 healthy men would have struggled to eat. Tarare, under the watchful eyes of the doctors, sat down and began to eat. He ate greedily, without stopping, until everything on the table was gone. Soon his stomach was expanding like a full balloon. Sweat poured out of him, a visible heat rising from his body. He collapsed on the bed, falling into a deep sleep, wheezing like a well-fed animal. The doctors were stunned. They had seen the impossible. They continued their experiments, giving him live animals and taking meticulous notes. But their curiosity did not stop at observation. The war was raging. France needed every advantage it could get. Their scientific curiosity was satisfied, but their ambition was not. And Dr. Corville, the more pragmatic one, devised a new experiment, one not only to learn, but also to use. One day, he brought in a small wooden box, an inanimate object, but it was about to transform Tarare from a medical experiment into an instrument of war, plunging him into an adventure whose danger and cruelty no hunger could match. The small wooden box was a test, but it was also a contract, one that Tarare had no idea he had signed. by swallowing and safely excreting the box. He had proven that his body was more than a medical anomaly. It was a national asset, a mobile secret chamber, undetectable by any search. General Alexander de Beauharnais, a nobleman who had sided with the revolution and a commander of the Army of the Rhine, was convinced. In a world without radio or telegraph, sending a message across enemy lines was a life-or-death gamble. Couriers could be captured, tortured, and messages confiscated. But Tarare, he was the perfect solution. He was a bioengineer, a human encryption machine. The plan was quickly formulated. Tarare's first mission, to deliver a message to a French colonel being held by the Prussians near the town of Neustadt. The message would be placed in a familiar wooden box. Tarare would swallow it, disguise himself as a German peasant, cross the border, find the colonel, and somehow deliver the box. The reward for success, if there was one, was designed to speak directly to his inner demons. Not gold, not glory. His reward was a wheelbarrow filled with 14 kilograms of raw beef lungs and liver. To a normal person, it was a disgusting sight. To Tarare, it was heaven. The motivation had been set. On the morning of the mission, Tarare swallowed the box. He was dressed in peasant clothes and released into the night with a blessing from Dr. Corville. But Tarare's tragedy was that, while he could hide a box in his stomach, he could not hide himself. He did not know a word of German. His strange appearance, his furtive gait, and his eyes constantly darting around looking for something to eat made him a suspect at first sight. The German peasants actually shunned him, and within hours he was arrested by a Prussian patrol. The search began. They stripped him, searched every crevice of his body, but found nothing. They could not find a message hidden in the usual way. Furious, they began to beat him. But Tarare, though in pain, would not talk. His loyalty was not to France. His fear was not for the Prussians. His greatest fear was failure, of returning empty-handed and facing hunger without reward. The Prussian commander, General Zoegli, was no fool. He noticed the prisoner's strange behavior, and although he could not imagine the truth, he suspected that the secret lay not in Tarare, but in him. A doctor was called in, and after examining him, he concluded that there was a foreign object in the prisoner's stomach. Unable to remove him by force, the Prussians chose another tactic, one even more brutal than torture. They chained Tarare to a latrine and fed him. They gave him plates of watery soup, pieces of bread, and then they waited. They didn't need to beat him anymore. They just needed to let nature take its course. Because the secret Tarare carried, wrapped in wood and sealed by the resolve of the French army, couldn't be hidden forever. It had its own agenda, and the deadline was fast approaching. 30 hours. 30 hours in a filthy Prussian latrine, chained to the wall, with a military secret slowly creeping through his body and a hunger gnawing at his very bones. For Tarare, it was a double hell. The physical pain from the beatings, the humiliation of the situation, and above all, the fear of what would happen next. And then, the moment came. The wooden box completed its journey through the biological maze of Tarare. In disgust and excitement, the Prussian soldiers retrieved it. The box, though covered in excrement, was intact. It was washed and brought before General Zoegli, who waited with the impatience of a predator. There it was, the French secret, the key to turning the tide of battle, contained in a small wooden box, transported by an unimaginable method. The general carefully opened the box. His officers gathered around him holding their breath. Inside was a piece of paper. He carefully took it out, and then his face changed from eagerness to confusion, and finally, to uncontrollable rage. The message contained no information about French troop numbers, positions, or strategies. It was simply a few lines, a note from Dr. Corville, asking if the box had arrived safely, and, if so, to send back some useful information about Prussian movements. It was a joke, a test. All this capture, torture, and humiliating wait was just part of a French doctor's experiment. General Zoegli and his entire command staff had been turned into rats in the enemy's laboratory. The general's rage needed a place to vent, and there was no more suitable target than Tarare, the deformed messenger who was shivering in a corner of the cell. Tarare was dragged from his cell, not to freedom, but to face vengeance. He was dragged to the execution ground, where a gallows stood majestically under a gray sky. Tarare did not understand what was happening, but he had a clear vision of the gallows. He began to scream, to beg in a language that was a mixture of French and the meaningless cries of an animal. A rough noose was placed around his neck. He could feel the weight of the rope, smell the scent of death. In that moment, his insatiable hunger vanished, replaced by a pure, primal terror. He was going to die, not from a bullet on the battlefield, but from a cruel joke. He closed his eyes, waiting for the plank beneath him to collapse, but never did. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, an officer cut the rope. Tarare collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, tears and saliva streaming down his face. It was a play, a psychological torture staged to punish and humiliate him. General Zoegli, after giving Tarare one last beating, roared at him to leave and never appear before him again. Beaten, humiliated, and broken, Tarare was set free. He trudged across the border and back into France. He had survived, but the hungry demon inside him had now tasted something worse than hunger: deliberate human cruelty. He was no longer a medical wonder or a potential weapon. He was simply a damaged creature. He made his way back to the military hospital, to Baron Percy, not out of curiosity, but out of desperation. He fell to his knees, weeping, begging the doctor to cure him at all costs. He no longer wanted to be a weapon or a wonder. He just wanted to be a normal human being. But the question was, for a man who had gone this far, was there any way back? For the first time in his life, Tarare wanted more than just to be fed. He wanted to be healed. His plea was not the cry of an empty stomach, but the cry of a soul broken to the limit. Baron Percy, a man of science but also of a kind heart, was moved. He decided that he would do everything in the power of 18th century medicine to extinguish the inferno inside his most unusual patient. The battle against the abyss began. They tried everything. Tarare was given laudanum, a powerful form of opium, in the hope that it would quell his hunger. It didn't work. They gave him wine vinegar and crushed tobacco tablets, which were supposed to suppress his appetite. To no avail. In a desperate attempt, they fed him large amounts of hard-boiled eggs, hoping that a controlled, protein-rich diet would bring him some balance. Tarare remained hungry. Each failure only added to the despair of both patient and doctor. Hunger was more than a symptom. It was an entity, an internal monster, and it was winning. No medicine, no prayer could touch it. And when it returned after failed attempts at treatment, it was more ferocious, more brazen, more demanding than before. Tarare, confined within the hospital walls, turned the place into his own personal hunting ground. He no longer ate scraps. He began to hunt. When other patients were bled, a common treatment at the time, Tarare would sneak in and drink their blood from the basins. When doctors discarded dirty bandages, he would rummage through them and eat them. But the real depravity begins when he discovers a plentiful supply, a place where death and silence reign: the hospital morgue. Several times, Tarare was caught by hospital staff in the morgue in the middle of the night. They found him gnawing on cold bodies, ripping out organs. He had crossed a sacred line. He was no longer eating to survive. He was eating death itself. To the doctors and nurses, he was no longer a pitiful patient. He had become a living horror, a scavenger stalking the very place they were trying to save. Baron Percy's patience and compassion finally reached their limits. He still believed Tarare was a patient suffering from some kind of mental illness, but the pressure from the other staff was too much. They threatened to leave the hospital if this monster was allowed to remain. And then, the worst happened. An event that turned disgust and fear into an undeniable accusation. A 14-month-old baby who was being treated in hospital disappeared from his crib without a trace. Chaos reigned. Nurses screamed. Doctors ran everywhere. The hospital was sealed off. A desperate search was launched, but to no avail. The child had vanished like vapor. But in everyone's mind, there was only one suspect. All eyes, all accusing fingers, pointed in one direction: to Tarare. There was no evidence. No one had seen him do it, but his previous actions had become a verdict. How could a man who could eat corpses not harm a newborn baby? Baron Percy tried to protect him one last time, but to no avail. The hospital crowd, furious and horrified, searched for Tarer. He escaped just in time, but the doors of this last refuge in the world slammed shut in his face. Vanished by the very people who had once tried to help him, Tarer disappeared once more into the night, into the dark alleys of France. This time, he carried more than the curse of hunger. He carried an even darker shadow, the shadow of a child eater. Vanished, accused, Tarer was no longer just a deformity. He was a hunted specter, a monster in the eyes of society. He disappeared into the shadows of post-revolutionary France, a country still in turmoil of its own. History is silent about his fate for the next 4 years. For years, a black void in an already dark life. How did he survive? Did his hunger find new victims in the darkness? Did he become a hunter of the night, a wolf in human skin, living off unrecorded crimes? Or did he simply live the life of a beast, a scavenger, existing at the lowest ebb of human society? We will never know for sure. Those 4 years were his own, a secret he took to the grave. And then, in 1798, the ghost appeared again. A gaunt man, looking even more miserable than before, had presented himself to the hospital in Versailles. It was Tarer, but the hellfire in his stomach seemed to have died down. He no longer screamed for food. His insatiable hunger had been replaced by another tormentor, an enemy from within. He was in the final stages of tuberculosis, and a constant bout of acute diarrhea was ravaging his decrepit body. A young doctor named Giroux de la Ville took him in, not with Percy's scientific curiosity, but with compassion for a dying creature. For weeks later, Tarer, the man who had eaten a feast for 15 people, who had devoured live cats and clocks, died in his hospital bed at the age of 26. He had died, not of starvation, but because his own body had rotted from the inside. But the story was not over yet. M. Tessier, a chief surgeon at the hospital who had known about Tararer's case before, decided that this was the last chance for science to look inside this extraordinary man. He wanted to perform an autopsy. As soon as the shroud was opened, a terrible stench, an unbearable stench of death, filled the room. The other surgeons fled, but Tessier, with the courage of a true scientist, stayed. He wanted to see the truth, and the truth was more terrifying than he could have imagined. When Tessier opened Tararer's mouth, he could see a tube leading almost straight down to the stomach. The entire esophagus was abnormally wide. His jaw could be opened unnaturally, almost dislocated. But that was just the surface. When the abdominal cavity was opened, the scene inside was a hell of putrefaction. His liver and gallbladder were abnormally large and in a state of gangrene. But the most shocking thing was the stomach. It was huge, loose, sagging, and took up most of the space in the abdomen. Its surface was covered with ulcers and patches of pus. His entire digestive system was a mess of decay, a biological machine eating itself. The stench became unbearable. Even a hardened man like Tessier was forced to give up. The autopsy had to be stopped midway. Tararer's final mystery, one that may have been in his nervous system or the structure of his brain, was buried with his rotting body. Science had a chance to understand him, and once again, it failed. It was repelled by the very horror it was trying to understand. Tarer, even in death, remains an untouchable mystery. The autopsy failed. The curtain fell. Tarer, dead, carried his secret to the grave, shrouded in a stench too horrible for science to penetrate. He had come into this world as a riddle, and he would leave as a riddle. In the more than 2 centuries since, modern medicine has tried to look back and offer belated diagnoses. Some have suggested that Tarer suffered from a severe form of hyperthyroidism, a condition that can cause a frenetic metabolism, constant sweating, and intense hunger. Others have pointed to damage to the amygdala or hypothalamus in his brain, the centers that control satiety and the instinct to eat. A rare genetic condition called Prader-Willi syndrome has also been considered. Each of these theories might explain some of the puzzle, but none of them can explain the whole thing. No diagnosis can adequately explain his ability to swallow large objects without choking, his ability to digest almost anything, and the sheer scale of his hunger that seems to come from another dimension. Tar-Rare remains an exception, a unique case, a challenge to our understanding of a human body. But perhaps to understand Tar-Rare, we must look beyond medicine. We must look to the times in which he lived. He was a perfect product of chaos, born into the abject poverty of feudal France, found a role in the ruthless world of traveling circuses and the curious, turned into a tool by the cold pragmatism of an army at war, and finally, shunned by the very society that had once intrigued and exploited him. Throughout his short and tragic life, Tar-Rare was treated as anything but human. To the crowd, he was a spectacle. To the doctors, he was an experiment. To the generals, he was a weapon. The question of whether he ate the child, while horrifying, is perhaps misplaced. The larger question is, who is the real monster in this story? A man tormented by an uncontrollable disease? Or a society that looked upon his suffering and saw only amusement or profit? Tar-Rare's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. It is not just about physical hunger. It is a metaphor for human hungers themselves. The hunger of the masses for the bizarre and the sensational. The hunger of science for knowledge, sometimes at the expense of morality. The hunger of war for new tools, however inhumane. Ultimately, the story of Tar-Rare is not about a man who could eat the world. It is about a world that tried to devour a man in many ways, and finally, when it had no more use for him, spat him out and left him to die in oblivion. His grave has no headstone, no memorial. A complete silence, as if society wanted to erase any trace of the existence of a phenomenon that had embarrassed and shamed them. Tar-Rare is a dark corner of history, a reminder that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and that the greatest horrors come not from ghosts or supernatural forces. They come from the fragile limits of the human body, and from the bottomless abyss in how we treat one another. There are stories that should not be told, not because they are not true, but because their truth transcends the limits of understanding, touching a forbidden zone where logic bows and primal fear reigns. Our story begins with a whisper from the dead, a faint radio signal that pierces the silence of the Straits of Malacca on a sultry June day in 1947. Imagine you are a radio operator on a merchant ship, cruising on a glassy sea. All around is an endless blue, an almost artificial peace. Suddenly, in your headset, a broken string of Morse code rings out, a trembling hand desperately trying to cling to life. SOS, SOS, from the Arang Medan. We are drifting. All the officers, including the captain, are dead, lying in the chart room and on the bridge. Perhaps the entire crew is dead. There is a dead silence for a few seconds, broken only by the static. Then, another series of jumbled codes, and finally, two final words, sent with the last of a dying man's strength, I die. And then, silence. Only the sound of the sea remained, indifferent and eternal. The terrifying SOS signal was picked up by several ships in the area. The nearest ship, the Silver Star, an American merchant ship, immediately changed course, racing full speed toward the coordinates. 2 hours later, the silhouette of a ship appeared on the horizon. It was the SS Arang Medan, a Dutch freighter drifting without a sign of life. There was no smoke from the funnel, not a soul on board. The ship was like a giant steel coffin, eerily silent under the harsh tropical sun. The captain of the Silver Star tried to communicate by whistle, by radio, but all he got in return was absolute silence. A sense of unease crept into the minds of the most experienced sailors. Something was terribly wrong. A landing party was formed. They carefully approached the ghost ship. When they set foot on the deck of the Medan, the first thing they felt was not the heat of the sun-baked metal, but a chill that was chilling, a chill that radiated from the ship itself, as if it had just passed through the icy depths of hell. And then they saw them. The first sight was on the bridge. The captain lay on his back, eyes wide open, staring up at the lifeless sky, mouth agape, as if in a silent scream. The other officers were in the same position, lying everywhere. All of their faces, frozen in an expression of utter horror. Not pain, not surprise, but pure terror, as if they had witnessed something the human mind could not bear. Fingers curled, raised in the air, as if trying to fight off an invisible enemy. Down below, the horrors were repeated. The entire crew, from cooks to mechanics to ordinary sailors, were dead. Each one was different, but all had the same expression. Eyes wide open, mouths agape, faces twisted in fear. Even the ship's dog, a German shepherd, was found dead, baring his teeth in a perpetual snarl at some unseen threat. The strangest thing? There was not a single wound on their bodies, not a drop of blood, no sign of a struggle or violence. They had simply died of fear. The radio operator was found slumped over the telegraph, fingers still on the keyboard, the one who had sent the last message. His face was also a mask of horror. The captain of the Silver Star, a man who had been at sea all his life, felt a strong urge to leave immediately. This ship was cursed. He decided to tow the Medan to the nearest port to investigate. But as the tow line was tightened, a faint smoke began to rise from Hold 4. The landing party hurried back to their ship. Within minutes, a loud explosion shattered the silence. The Medan shook, flames erupted, and then it began to sink. With unnatural speed, the steel coffin slid beneath the waves, taking the bodies and their secrets with it to the bottom of the ocean, lost forever. The ship self-destructed, as if to erase evidence of the nightmare that had unfolded on its decks. But it left behind a question, one that would haunt investigators, historians, and curious minds for decades to come. What drove a seasoned crew to die in such utter terror on a calm sea, under the sun? And why did the ship destroy itself so violently? The answers, if any, lie not on the surface of the sea, but buried in secret documents, forgotten records, and the darkness of a war that had just ended. A ship disappearing is not uncommon on the ocean, but a ship that obliterates itself after sending out a distress call is another story. The explosion and the rapidity with which the Medan sank dashed any hope of a field investigation. All that remains are the accounts of the Silver Star's crew in a name, Medan, the man from Medan, a Dutch name for a ship, but as investigators began to comb through the records, they hit their first wall of silence. There was no official record of a ship named the SS Medan in the Lloyd's Register or any other major shipping authority at the time. It was a literal ghost ship, not just in death, but in existence. Where did it come from? Who did it belong to? And more importantly, what was it carrying and hold for where the explosion occurred? The silence from the authorities fueled speculation. Amid the ashes of World War II, the world was in the throes of a chaotic rebuilding. Sea lanes were still rife with unnamed dangers, not just mines, but clandestinely smuggled military secrets. The first and most mundane theory was that the Medan was carrying an illicit cargo. It could have been weapons, gold, or was something much more sensitive. The explosion could have been a malfunction with the cargo, or a deliberate act of sabotage to cover up the evidence. But this theory failed to explain the core. Why did the entire crew die with such horrified expressions? A chemical leak would have caused suffocation, convulsions, burns, not silent, frozen fear. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. A handful of independent researchers, dissatisfied with the official silence, have dug into the rumors and fragments of information. They have found a tenuous link, a glimmer of a project the world would rather forget. Unit 731. For those who don't know, Unit 731 was a secret biological and chemical weapons research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. The experiments they performed on humans were beyond the definition of cruelty. They created deadly diseases, nerve gases capable of killing silently. After Japan's surrender, many of Unit 731's key scientists were secretly granted immunity from prosecution by the United States government in exchange for their research data. A dark deal, an ethical trade-off for an advantage in the coming Cold War. The theory goes, what if the Aurang Medan wasn't a regular cargo ship, but a floating laboratory or a ship carrying the deadly legacy of Unit 731? Perhaps the ship, under a false name, was on its way to deliver a shipment of biological or chemical weapons to some power. A shipment of things like sarin, taboon, or perhaps something even more horrifying, a nerve agent designed to induce terrifying hallucinations before killing its victims. Picture this scenario. A small tank leaks in the cargo hold. A colorless, odorless gas slowly spreads throughout the ship. It does not cause asphyxiation or immediate physical pain. Instead, it attacks the central nervous system, the part of the brain responsible for fear. It amplifies the deepest terrors in each person's subconscious, turning them into vivid, lifelike visions. The crew does not see a physical enemy. They see their own personal hell. Some see unimaginable monsters. Others see their loved ones being tortured. Or perhaps they simply face an emptiness, an existential horror beyond words. Death came slowly, not from poison, but from their own brains shutting down from the overload. Their hearts stopped beating from fear. That was why their eyes were wide open, their mouths gaping in a wordless scream. They had died from witnessing the unimaginable. The radio operator, in his last conscious moments, tried to send out a warning, but his hallucinated brain could only describe the chaos and death that surrounded him. And the explosion? Maybe it was a safety mechanism. If the cargo was compromised, it would self-destruct to prevent a global pandemic. Or maybe the chemical, when exposed to salt water or air, would become extremely explosive. Either way, the ship and its secrets were buried. This theory, though creepy, fits all the details unsettlingly. The woundless death, the horrified expressions, the sudden disappearance of the ship. It turns the Aurang Medan from a maritime ghost story into a hidden chapter in the history of war, a reminder that the most terrifying demons come not from the deep, but from man himself. The Unit 731 theory, with all the horror and allure of a hidden conspiracy, seems like the perfect explanation. It is tinged with the tragedy of war, human cruelty, and government cover-ups. It turns the Aurang Medan into a symbol of unpunished crimes. But history, like the ocean, is rarely smooth. It has undercurrents, unexpected waves, and sometimes the answers lie not in grand conspiracies, but in overlooked technical details. Let's put aside the stories of bioweapons and evil scientists. Look at the Aurang Medan not as a coffin filled with military secrets, but as an old ship, a steel machine with boilers, engines, and a complex system of pipes. And in the world of machines, silence is often a sign of a fatal malfunction. Another group of investigators, more realistic, has proposed another scenario, one no less terrifying, but one rooted in technological failure rather than human malevolence. Their theory revolves around a silent killer, something every sailor is wary of: carbon monoxide, CO. Imagine the boiler system of the Aurang Medan malfunctions. A small crack, a leak in a pipe, and CO, a byproduct of incomplete combustion, begins to leak. It is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It slowly fills the engine compartments, seeps through the doors, enters the ventilation system, and spreads throughout the ship. The crew would not notice immediately. The initial symptoms were vague: headaches, dizziness, nausea. They might have thought it was seasickness or the tropical heat. But as the CO levels rose, it began to displace oxygen from the blood, slowly starving the brain and internal organs. Confusion, impaired judgment, mild hallucinations. The entire crew, from the bridge to the engine room, were slowly slipping into an eternal sleep without even realizing it. Death came gently, almost peacefully, but this contradicts the expression of horror. A peaceful death by CO asphyxiation cannot produce faces frozen in fear. And this is where the theory adds another element, a detail that is often mentioned in different versions of the story: the cargo that the Aurang Medan was carrying. According to some unofficial sources, the ship's cargo holds contained large quantities of potassium cyanide and nitroglycerin. Now, let's put the pieces together. Not only is the boiler leaking CO, it's also creating a smoldering fire. The fire is damaging the hull structure, allowing seawater to flood into the cargo hold. And when the seawater comes into contact with potassium cyanide, a deadly chemical reaction occurs, releasing a cloud of highly toxic hydrogen cyanide gas. The gas attacks the nervous system violently, causing convulsions, paralysis, and death within minutes. So the scenario now becomes more complex and terrifying. The crew is slowly being weakened by CO, their minds are hazy, their bodies are sluggish. Suddenly, a second wave of the poison hits, stronger and faster. Perhaps it is at this moment, as their bodies convulse in their final moments, as their nervous systems are destroyed, their faces are distorted into the masks of pain and horror that the Silver Star sailors saw. That silent scream is not a scream of spiritual fear, but the final physical reaction of a body being destroyed from within by chemicals. And the nitroglycerin? That was the explanation for the explosion. The smoldering fire from the boilers had finally reached the unstable cargo. Boom! An explosion powerful enough to rip the ship apart and send it plunging to the bottom of the ocean, erasing all evidence of a catastrophic industrial accident. This theory is scientifically sound. It explains the mass deaths, the lack of violence, and the ship's destruction. It makes the Aurang Medan a warning about the dangers of transporting toxic cargo on old ships. A sad story, but understandable. But it leaves out one crucial detail, one that has haunted everyone who has heard the story since the beginning. That expression. The accounts of the witnesses aboard the Silver Star don't just describe pain. They describe terror. They describe twisted arms pointing to something in the sky, as if trying to fend off an invisible attacker from above. Poison gas can kill you, but can it make an entire crew look in the same direction and point to a common horror? The chemical theory, while plausible, feels too clean, too neat. It lacks the element of absurdity, the insanity that has turned this story into a legend. Perhaps the answer lies neither in chemical reactions nor in human conspiracies. Perhaps it lies somewhere in between, or in another dimension altogether. When logic and science retreat, when human conspiracies seem too complex, the imagination begins to wander into forbidden territories. It seeks explanations not in books, but in the echoes of the universe, in frequencies that the human ear cannot hear, but the body can feel. And here we enter one of the strangest and most terrifying theories about the Aurang Medan: infrasound. Sound is a weapon. We know that. But what about the sounds we can't hear? Infrasound are extremely low-frequency vibrations, below 20 hertz, beyond the range of human hearing. They are created by monumental events, earthquakes under the sea, violent storms thousands of miles away, or even the huge, old engines of a ship. They are the silent scream of nature, an invisible force that can affect matter and, more importantly, the human mind. Imagine another scenario. The Aurang Medan, on its fateful voyage, accidentally entered an acoustic dead zone, a rare and perfect confluence of factors. A small seismic event on the seafloor, combined with a particular weather pattern, created a column of intense infrasound waves, focused directly on the ship's location. Or perhaps its own failing propulsion system created a deadly, resonant frequency. At first, no one noticed anything, just a vague sense of unease, a slight flutter in the chest. The ship's dog, with its heightened senses, might have begun to whine, growl into the void. Then the unease turned to nameless fear. Heart rate increased. Paranoia began to sprout. Sailors looked at each other suspiciously. They heard whispers at the edges of their hearing, saw shadows pass by at the corners of their eyes. That's because infrasound at a certain frequency, around 19 hertz, also known as the phantom frequency, can vibrate human eyeballs, creating visual illusions. It acts directly on the nervous system, triggering a fight or flight response without any tangible threat. The fear the crew felt wasn't coming from a monster or an enemy. It was coming from the air they were breathing, from the vibrations that coursed through their bodies. The intensity of the infrasound increased. The psychological fear now turned into a physical attack. The intense vibrations could cause shortness of breath, severe dizziness, and even internal organ damage. In their final moments, the crew was no longer fighting an imaginary enemy. They were being tortured to death by their own environment. They looked up at the sky not because they saw something, but perhaps out of reflex, a desperate attempt to escape the invisible pressure that was crushing them. The silent screams on their faces were a mark of extreme pain and terror, as their bodies were shaken to the point of being torn apart from within. Death came quickly, simultaneously, without leaving any visible injuries. An explosion? A powerful enough infrasonic wave could have caused enough vibrations to detonate a volatile cargo like nitroglycerin. The same energy that killed the crew signed the ship's death warrant, ensuring that the secret of that deadly frequency would remain forever buried at the bottom of the ocean. This theory, with its blend of real science and creepy mystery, seems to encompass every aspect of the story. It is both natural and supernatural. It turns the ocean from a backdrop to the main villain, a near-perfect explanation. But the story of the Arang Medan has one final twist, one that is even more shocking than theories about secret weapons or demonic frequencies. A twist that asks not what happened to the ship, but a much simpler and more disturbing question. Did the Arang Medan really exist? In the dusty drawers of history, there are ghosts created not by tragedy, but by the human pen. And the ghost of the Arang Medan may be the most terrifying of them all. Over the course of our journey, we have sailed through seas of possibility, from dark military conspiracies to catastrophic chemical accidents to bizarre physical theories. Each theory is an island, a temporary refuge for our logic from the storm of absurdity. But all of these islands are built on a single foundation, that the SS Arang Medan really did exist. Now we face the final abyss, a terrifying than sea monsters or nerve gas. The possibility that there was no ship, no crew died. It was all just a story. This is when the investigation shifted from the ocean to the dusty archives, from the telescope to the magnifying glass. Researchers, skeptics, began another hunt, not for a cause, but for an origin. And what they found, or rather what they didn't find, shook the entire myth. The first and most solid bulwark against any legitimate ship is the Lloyd's Register, the Bible of the shipping industry. The name of the Arang Medan does not appear there. Not in 1947, not before, not since. They searched the records of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Batavia, the major ports of the Netherlands. Still silence. The ship has no registration number, no recorded history, no official owner. It is a ghost in the archives. Even the name, Arang Medan, is suspicious. It is not standard Dutch. In Malay and Indonesian, Orang Medan means man from Medan, a port city on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. It sounds more like a nickname, a folk name, than the official name of a Dutch merchant ship. It is as if the narrator chose a name with a mystical Far Eastern feel to add to the allure of his story. And what about the rescue ship, the Silver Star? The crew of the Silver Star had the only clue to the whole story. But when investigators tried to locate the ship, they ran into another maze. There were several ships named Silver Star during that period, but none of their logs recorded a terrifying encounter with the Arang Medan in the Strait of Malacca. All leads led to dead ends. So where did this story come from? Tracing the newspaper accounts, one finds its origins in a series of articles published in February and March 1948 in De Locomotief, a Dutch-language newspaper in Indonesia. From there, it was picked up by the Associated Press and spread around the world. But all of these articles cited a single source, an anonymous witness from the Silver Star who was never identified. The story was based on another ghost story. In the 1950s, A German author named Otto Mielke wrote about this incident in the series of books Das Totenschiff auf hoher See, The Ship That Died at Sea. It was Mielke who added many sensational details, embellishing the story, turning it from a strange news item into an immortal maritime legend. It is very possible that we are not analyzing a historical event, but analyzing an excellent work of horror literature. If you look at it as a made-up story, everything suddenly becomes suspiciously perfect. It is the perfect horror formula. The desperate cry for help? Check. The ghost ship adrift? Check. The unexplained mystery, the bodies dying of fright? Check. And most importantly, the convenient destruction of all evidence? Check. The explosion closes all doors of investigation, allowing the imagination to run free forever. The story of the Aurang Medan doesn't need to be true because it's too good to be false. It has become a self-replicating virus in the collective consciousness, a modern parable about our fears of the sea and the unknown. And so, we can close the case. Aurang Medan is just an urban legend, a campfire tale told by sailors, a ghost born of ink and newspaper. A logical, neat, and somewhat disappointing conclusion. But history always has its buts. There's always a missing detail, a piece of the puzzle that refuses to let the story rest. In May 1959, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, the CIA, declassified a document. In it, there was a letter to the CIA director in which the writer reported information he had heard from a friend. The friend claimed to have served on a ship in the Strait of Malacca and knew of a sole survivor of the Aurang Medan tragedy. The survivor was a German sailor, reportedly found on a life raft by a missionary and locals in the Marshall Islands. He died shortly after telling his horrifying tale, a tale of mysterious deaths and a deadly cargo hidden in the ship's hold. This CIA memo proves nothing. It is merely a retelling of another story, a rumor recorded in an official document. But its existence stirs up the waters once again. Why would the CIA care about a maritime ghost story? Is it because it isn't a ghost story? The absence of registration records could also be explained in another way. In the chaotic post-war world, off-the-books operations were commonplace. A ship engaged in arms smuggling, transporting wanted scientists, or carrying out a secret intelligence mission would never be officially registered. The absence of evidence, in this case, could be evidence of a high-level cover-up. The mystery of the Aurang Medan, at last, has grown beyond itself. It is no longer a question of a ship, but of the nature of truth and story. Perhaps the ship was real, but the story was distorted. Perhaps the story was real, but the ship was only a code name. Or perhaps, most terrifyingly, the whole event is a tear in the tapestry of history, a blind spot where fact and fiction merge, leaving us with an eternal echo. The Aurang Medan, whether in flesh or in words, has done its job perfectly. It has become the ultimate coffin, burying not just a crew, but the truth itself. And all it leaves us, the curious on the shore, is a spine-chilling question, one that will never be fully answered. We have come to the end of the journey, to the end of the chart, where all paths fade into mist. We have followed the Aurang Medan through the storms of conspiracy, through the calm seas of scientific reason, and finally, into the void of history itself, where a story can and cannot be. Now, with all the theories lying before us like the wreckage of shipwreck, perhaps the right question is not which theory is true, but what does each theory say about our own fears? Let's look at them again, not as solutions, but as mirrors. The first mirror, gleaming with the cold steel of war, is the theory of Unit 731 and the death cargo. This is the fear of humanity itself. The fear that, deep down, we have the capacity to create instruments of pure destruction, that our evil can be bottled and shipped across the oceans. Aurang Medan in this mirror is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters do not rise from the sea, but from laboratories, wearing white coats and carrying briefcases of classified documents. It is the fear of a legacy of evil that we try to bury, but that continues to float, a time bomb of history. The second mirror, the calm and indifferent mirror of nature, reflects the hypothesis of chemical accidents and infrasound. This is the fear of meaninglessness, the fear that the universe does not care about our existence, that a random combination of molecules, a random vibration of the Earth's crust, can wipe out an entire crew without any reason, purpose, or malice. In this mirror, their deaths are not heroic, not a warning, they simply happen. Arang Medan becomes a symbol of the fragility of human life before the cold laws of physics, a whisper that our life is but a small spark, extinguished at any moment by an invisible wind. And the third mirror, the most cracked and distorted, is the hypothesis of a hoax or cover-up. This is the fear of modernity, the fear of the information vacuum, the fear that truth is not a solid rock, but a mist that can be shaped or blown away at will. If the Arang Medan is not true, it proves that a sufficiently haunting story can become true. If it is true and has been covered up, it proves that power can erase truth from history. Either possibility leads to a disturbing conclusion. We live in a world where we cannot trust the very things we read, the very stories that have shaped our past. Amid these three horrors, the story of Arang Medan finds its enduring power. But perhaps, to truly feel the pulse of the legend, we must return to its heart, the story of the lone survivor. Whether he is a forgotten real person or a figment of the imagination, he is our emotional bridge to the tragedy. Imagine, for a moment, his dying words, the fragmented words of a mind shattered by terror. It wasn't people. It wasn't the mist. It came from below, no, from within, from a metal, from the air. A cold fire. It didn't burn the flesh, it burned the mind. My brothers, it didn't scream. Do you understand? The most terrifying thing was the silence. They just opened their mouths, and terror flooded in, turning them to stone. Their eyes saw not death, but the end of everything. They pointed not to the sky, but through the sky, pointed to the emptiness behind it all. The package. God, the package. We were ordered not to open it. They said it was the sealed fury of the devil. But we didn't need to open it. It found its way out. That account, whether true or not, did what no other archive could. It gave fear a voice. It turned the nameless bodies into brothers, into comrades. Ultimately, the mystery of the Arang Medan lies not in the answers. It lies in the questions themselves. The ghost ship has become a mythical space, a Rorschach test of the sea, where each of us sees our deepest fears. It is proof that, even in the 21st century, when we have mapped the ocean floor and sent robots into space, there are still blank areas on the map of human knowledge. These blank spaces are both disturbing and strangely fascinating. They remind us that we don't know everything, and perhaps we shouldn't. Perhaps the Arang Medan never really sank. Perhaps it is still out there, a ship of questions, forever drifting on the ocean of the collective unconscious. Its crew is no longer Dutch, Indonesian, or German. It is us, trying to find meaning in the silence, trying to look into the darkness, and hoping that nothing will look back. And its final SOS, echoing through 8 decades, may not have been a cry for help, but it is a warning. There are words that carry more weight than history. They are not mere characters carved into wood or inscribed on paper, but scars, openings into an abyss of silence. And in the annals of disappearances, no word is more haunting, mysterious, and controversial than a single word, found on a deserted island in the late 16th century. A word that, to this day, remains the only answer and the biggest question in the disappearance of more than 100 people. That word is Croton. Our story begins in 1587, during the age of conquest and discovery, when Queen Elizabeth I of England sought to plant her flag in the New World, challenging Spanish dominance. Under the auspices of Sir Walter Raleigh, a group of 117 men, women, and children set sail across the Atlantic with a dream to establish the first permanent English colony in the Americas. They were not soldiers, but families, craftsmen, farmers carrying seeds and hope. Their destination was Roanoke Island, a strip of land off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their leader was John White, an artist, cartographer, and a grandfather. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a girl on the island, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. Virginia's birth was a symbol, a seedling of empire, a promise of a future rooted in new land. But this land, with its lush jungles and mysterious native tribes, was not a blank slate. It was the deep blue continent, which promised riches and whispered death. Just months after landing, the fledgling colony faced harsh realities. Supplies were running low, and relations with the local tribes were increasingly strained. John White was forced to make a painful decision. He would return to England alone to bring back more men and supplies. He said goodbye to his daughter Eleanor and his young granddaughter Virginia, with the promise to return in a few months. That was the last time he saw them. Fate played a cruel trick on John White. By the time he returned to England, war with the Spanish Armada had broken out. Every ship was requisitioned for the war effort. What had been a few months' promise turned into 3 long years. 3 years stranded, haunted by the images of those he had left behind. It was not until August 1590 that John White was able to return to Roanoke. As his ship approached the shore, a deathly silence fell. There should have been the sound of hammering, children playing, men calling to each other. Instead, there was only the wind howling through the fences and the waves crashing against the sand. As he set foot on the island, his worst fears began to materialize. The settlement was gone, but this was not a scene of destruction. There was no sign of a battle, no bodies, no burned houses. On the contrary, everything seemed to have been cleaned up in an orderly manner. Most of the houses had been carefully dismantled. The defensive fences were still standing. Clearly, they had not been attacked. They had left. But where? And then he saw it. On a tree at the edge of the forest, 3 letters were carved into the bark. Ciro. John White's heart pounded. Before they left, they had made a secret pact. If they had to move, they would carve their destination. If they had to leave in danger, they would carve a Maltese cross next to the name. He hurried toward the center of the settlement, where there was a large pillar of the fence. And there, carved deep and clear, was a single word, a place name, a silent message that had endured 3 years of waiting. Croton. There is no cross. They left voluntarily. They reached Croton Island, home to the friendly Manteo tribe, about 50 miles south. A glimmer of hope. But as White prepared to sail for Croton, the skies darkened. A huge storm arose, an Atlantic hurricane, making further southward travel impossible. After several failed attempts and a mutiny by the crew, the ship was forced to return to England. A heartbroken John White never had the money to finance another voyage. He died a few years later, never knowing what had happened to his daughter, granddaughter, and lost colony. History left them there, caught between a name and a storm. 117 souls vanished into the wilds of America, leaving behind a single word as their tombstone. And the question that has lingered for over 400 years begins. What does Croton really mean? Is it a destination? A warning? Or the name of the very thing that swallowed them? To John White standing on that desolate shore, Croton was not a demonic word. It was a ray of hope, a beacon in the midst of despair. Because Croton was more than just an island. It was the home of Manteo. Manteo was no obscure chief. He was one of 2 natives who had voluntarily accompanied the English explorers back to London years earlier. He had lived in the heart of the empire, learned their language, observed their culture, and was even baptized as a Christian. He was a living bridge between the 2 worlds, a trusted friend to the English. When they returned to Roanoke, Manteo, now chief of the Croton tribe, was named Lord of Roanoke and Dasamungwapong by the English, a diplomatic gesture that cemented the alliance. So the most plausible hypothesis, and the one most supported by mainstream historians, is not a horror story, but a story of realistic survival. The assimilation hypothesis. Picture this scenario. Winter is approaching. Supplies have long since run out. John White's promises have become a distant echo. The settlers, isolated and facing several hostile tribes around them, realize they cannot survive on their own. Their only option is to seek help from the only friends they have in this strange land, the Croton tribe of Manteo. The careful dismantling of homes now takes on a different meaning. It is not a sign of panic, but of preparation. They are salvaging the most precious, irreplaceable materials: iron nails, door hinges, locks, and perhaps the best planks. They are not fleeing. They are relocating. The 50-mile journey south to Croton Island, now Hatteras Island, was certainly arduous. But when they arrived, they were welcomed. A cultural exchange began, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. The English brought metal tools, knowledge of European agriculture, and building techniques. The Crotons taught them how to hunt in the dense forests, fish in the shallows, grow corn and squash, and survive the harsh New World winters. Virginia Dare, the colony's poster child, may have grown up not with English hymns, but with Croton fireside tales. Her blonde hair may have been braided in the native style. She and the other children in the colony learned to speak two languages, to play games. Over time, the lines began to blur. Interracial marriages occurred. New families were formed, with blood from both peoples. The Roanoke colony did not disappear. It simply dissolved, becoming part of a larger, more resilient community. This theory is not mere conjecture. It is supported by later accounts. In 1709, more than a century later, explorer John Lawson visited the area and recorded that he encountered Indians on Hatteras Island who claimed to be of white ancestry. They had gray eyes, a trait not common among natives, and they reported that some of their ancestors could speak from a book. In modern times, projects like the Lost Colony DNA Project are attempting to trace genetic lines, connecting families who lived in the area for centuries to the surnames of the Roanoke settlers. The assimilation hypothesis turns a chilling mystery into a human story of cooperation and adaptation. It suggests that amid the conflicts of empires, ordinary people can find a common path to survival. The story might have ended here, with a surprisingly happy ending. The colony was not lost. They were found, not by ships from England, but by the kindness of their neighbors. But history is rarely so simple. For if they had survived and assimilated, why did they disappear from later records entirely? Why did they never attempt to contact other English colonies founded later, such as Jamestown? Their complete silence is a mystery in itself. And then another ghost of history appears, carrying a very different story. A story not written in ink, but carved in stone. A series of stones, known as the Dare Stones, were allegedly found in the 1930s. On these stones, said to have been carved by Eleanor Dare, Virginia Dare's mother, is a story not of union, but of a bloody escape, of disease and brutal attacks, ending in massacre. If these stones are real, then Croton is not the final destination. It is merely a way station on a journey to destruction. If the assimilation hypothesis is a hymn to life, then the Dare Stones are a dirge to doom. They are a parallel history, a nightmare carved into stone, a terrible secret that threatens to completely erase the human story of harmony we have painted. This story began not in a primeval forest, but in the hands of a traveler in 1937. The man, while searching for nuts near the banks of the Chowan River, stumbled upon a nearly 10 kilograms boulder of quartz. On its surface were crudely carved words. It was a message from the past, a suicide note from Eleanor White Dare, Virginia Dare's mother, to the father she would never see again. The first stone tells a heartbreaking story. It tells how, 2 years after John White left, the settlers suffered from disease and war, which claimed the lives of nearly half of them, including her husband, Ananias Dare. Virginia Dare, the child of hope, was now a fatherless child. The message ends with a desperate plea that whoever finds the stone bring it to her father. And it reveals that the survivors had to leave Roanoke Island, moving further inland. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world. It seemed like the lost key, the voice of the insiders themselves. A history professor from Emory University, believing it to be the find of the century, offered a reward to anyone who could find more similar stones. And then, something miraculous happened. More than 40 more stones began to appear, all found by a single man. The stones that followed told an even darker story. They were a diary of a desperate journey. They told of an exodus into the wilderness, an escape from hostile tribes. Each stone was a tombstone, recording the ever-increasing death toll. They traveled west, then south, across rivers and forests with no place to call home. Hope faded, replaced by fear and hunger. And then, the final stone, the one that ends the story. It tells of a final assault, a battle they cannot win. It tells of a massacre. The final words, supposedly carved by Eleanor just before she died, are a chilling summation. All but 7 died. These were rescued by a friendly tribe, but their fates are then shrouded in mystery. The story of the Dare Stones paints a different picture. The Croton was not a refuge, but a temporary stopover before they were sent on a deadly journey. It explains why they disappeared from history, simply because they were almost all killed. The mystery seems to have been solved, albeit in the most tragic way. But as with everything in the Roanoke story, there was a twist. As the initial excitement died down, doubts began to arise. Why had all the stones been found by just one person? Coincidentally, the man was a stonecutter. Linguists began analyzing the text. They found that, despite attempts to imitate Elizabethan English, the letters, spellings, and some of the words were modern, mistakes that a 16th century Englishman like Eleanor Dare would not have made. An investigation by the Saturday Evening Post in 1941 dealt a fatal blow. It exposed the whole story, pointed out inconclusive inconsistencies, and concluded that it was highly likely that all 47 stones after the first were an elaborate hoax, created to capture the prize money. The entire academic community turned against it. The Dare Stones, from historical relics, became symbols of naivety and fraud. And so, another dramatic solution is shattered. The door that has just opened slams shut. But this hoax, whether real or not, inadvertently plants in our minds another image, another possibility, one even more brutal than assimilation. The stones could be fake. But does that mean the story of the massacre is also fake? What if the hoaxer has simply rewritten a scenario that actually took place, a scenario that does not need stone to be engraved because it was written in blood? History doesn't need stones to record a massacre. It only needs violence, fear, and a perpetrator. The fact that the Dare Stones were a hoax doesn't diminish the darkest possibility of the Roanoke story. On the contrary, it strips away the romantic plot and leaves us with a stark 16th century truth. The New World was a dangerous place, and the weak would not survive. The idea of a massacre of total annihilation always looms in the background. If the colony had been wiped out, the next question was, by whom? There were 2 main candidates, 2 powerful forces with both the motive and the ability to extinguish the fledgling flame of British colonialism. The first candidate comes from across the ocean, the Spanish Empire. In the late 16th century, Spain considered the Americas its backyard. It already had powerful colonies in Florida and the Caribbean. The presence of an outpost of its archenemy, England, right on its northern flank, was an unacceptable threat. Roanoke was more than just a colony. It could become a base for English privateers like Sir Francis Drake, who had repeatedly attacked and plundered Spanish gold ships. The destruction of Roanoke was not just a military act, but a warning. We know that Spanish warships patrolled the area. A swift, brutal attack that left no witnesses was well within their capabilities and modus operandi. But there was another culprit, a force closer to home, more complex, and perhaps more terrifying. A force that came from the very forest that surrounded the island. It was the Powhatan Confederacy. Make no mistake, this is not a simple story of wild natives attacking civilized settlers. The leader of this confederacy, Wahunsenkaw, whom the English called Powhatan, was one of the most astute political and military leaders on the continent at the time. He had spent years building a mighty empire, conquering and uniting dozens of smaller tribes under his rule. He understood power and its delicate balance. The English presence, with its guns, strange diseases, and a different god, was a destabilizing factor. Powhatan may have seen the Roanoke colony, isolated and weakened by years without supplies, not as a partner, but as a seed of future trouble. Or perhaps some of the Roanoke had already provoked or allied themselves with a tribe that was an enemy of Powhatan. Destroying them would kill two birds with one stone, remove an outside threat, and send a bloody message to any tribe in the area that dared challenge his authority. This theory is more than just conjecture. It has an eyewitness, however controversial. Nearly 20 years later, when the Jamestown colony was founded in the North, Captain John Smith, one of the leaders of Jamestown, wrote in his journal about a conversation with Powhatan himself. According to Smith, the powerful chief confessed that he had ordered and supervised the massacre of the Roanoke people. Powhatan said he had done so because they had begun living with a rival tribe, refusing to submit to him. As evidence, Powhatan is said to have shown John Smith a musket barrel, a copper mortar, and some pieces of iron, trophies taken from the massacre. This confession, if true, is the smoking gun of the case. It explains everything: the political motive, the perpetrators, and the ultimate fate of the 117 men. They did not assimilate. They were not sick. They were executed by a rising native empire, a forgotten tragedy in the clash of civilizations. But like every other explanation in this story, the massacre theory runs into a fatal contradiction, a detail that cannot be ignored, a detail that John White himself recorded clearly. Is the scene. John White did not find a battlefield. He found a neatly cleaned-up settlement. The houses were carefully dismantled. The fences were intact. There was no sign of a struggle, no human bones, no bloodstains. A brutal massacre could not have happened so neatly and orderly. This contradiction is an insurmountable wall. How can a community be brutally massacred and yet have time to dismantle its homes and carve a calm message on a pillar? Unless the massacre and the exodus did not happen at the same time. Unless the truth is much more complicated, a combination of multiple tragedies overlapping. A tidy crime scene and a bloody confession. A message of peaceful evacuation and a story of brutal destruction. These two truths are like oil and water, incompatible. They are a paradox, a logical wall that every historian of Roanoke must confront. But what if we are wrong to assume that both must have taken place in the same place, with the same group of people? What if the lost colony was not a single entity, but rather fragmented? This is where we enter a complex hypothesis, a scenario that reconciles contradictions by acknowledging a simple truth: people rarely act in unison. The separation hypothesis. Let's go back to 1587. 117 people, but not 117 thinking alike. Faced with isolation and hunger, there were certainly factions, arguments about the way forward. The most likely scenario is that they came to a compromise. The majority of the colony, presumably including most of the women and children for safety, did exactly as the Croton message instructed. Led by the moderates, they made their move to Croton Island, where their Manteo allies awaited them. They carefully dismantled their homes, gathered their supplies, and made their way south in an orderly fashion. This perfectly explained the orderly scene that John White had found. The word Croton was not a mystery, but rather a map, a clear message. But a smaller group, perhaps single men, ex-soldiers, or more adventurous souls, disagreed. They did not want to be refugees living on the mercy of a native tribe. They were still haunted by their original dream: to find gold, to find a route to the Pacific, or simply to explore the vast interior. This group decided to split off, to head in a different direction, perhaps west, along the Chowan River, deep into the territory of tribes they had never heard of. And it was this small group, not the entire colony, that Powhatan was talking about. A lone band of white men, intruding deep into his territory, may have caused conflict, competition for resources, or simply made their presence a political pretext. The massacre that Powhatan confessed to John Smith was real, but the victims were not the 117. The victims were the small group that broke away and went to their deaths. The artifacts Powhatan presented, the barrels of the guns, the bronze mortars, were theirs. John Smith, hearing the story, could not have known this complexity and assumed that the entire colony had been wiped out. This theory resolves the paradox ingeniously. It accepts both pieces of evidence, the orderly scene at Roanoke and Powhatan's confession. It divides a large mystery into two smaller, more tragic stories. But it raises a new question. If the majority of the colony made it safely to Croton, what happened to them? Why did they disappear from history? The answer may lie in a killer even more brutal than the sword: disease. The Europeans brought with them diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which they had developed resistance over generations. But for the Native Americans, these diseases were a death sentence. It is possible that the Roanoke settlers, while living in peace with the Crotons, inadvertently brought a pandemic, a small-scale Columbian exchange, that wiped out both their hosts and their visitors. The survivors, if any, were small, scattered, and completely assimilated into neighboring tribes over generations. The gray eyes, the stories of white ancestors, were the last echoes of a forgotten community. This split hypothesis, with its combination of displacement, massacre, and disease, is the most comprehensive and widely accepted explanation today. It is plausible, it is evidence-based, and it paints a tragic but plausible picture. There is, however, one final element, one loose thread that remains hanging, one that empirical historians often avoid. It is the word Croton itself. We have assumed it was a place name. But in the world of the 16th century, a world steeped in alchemy, mystical symbols, and curses, could a word simply be a word? John Dee, the famous alchemist and mystic, was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth. Sir Walter Raleigh was also deeply interested in the occult. Is it possible that the settlers, in their desperation, did more than just carve out place name? Was Croton a power word, a magic spell, a symbol of transformation, or an invocation to a power older than man? What if we have been reading the clues wrong all along? Forget the maps. Put away the chronicles of kings and wars. To understand the final, deepest meaning of Roanoke, we may have to read other books. Books about alchemy, about arcane symbols, about the ancient connection between words and power. We must try to see the world through the eyes of a 16th century man. For them, the world was not a machine operating according to clear physical laws. It was a living tapestry, woven of visible and invisible forces. Demons, angels, and nature spirits were real entities. A curse could bring disease. A properly carved symbol could protect a house. This was the age of John Dee, mathematician, astronomer, and Elizabethan mystic who spent his life trying to communicate with angels through an Enochian language. Sir Walter Raleigh, the colony's patron, was also deeply interested in alchemy and the secrets of the universe. The settlers carried that faith across the Atlantic. They were not just coming to a new land. They were coming to a magical land, a place where the rules of the old world no longer seemed to apply. In the face of hunger, disease, and silence from their homeland, would their Christian faith hold firm? Or, in their utter desperation, would they turn to another kind of power, a magic more ancient, more primal? And this is where we must look at the word Croton one last time, not as a place name, but as a symbol. Theory 1. It was an amulet. In many folklores, carving a powerful word or symbol could ward off evil spirits or disease. Perhaps, when the plague began to spread, settlers, in an act of mixed faith and superstition, carved the name of a strong, powerful native tribe into their village gates, not to show them the way, but to ask for protection, to borrow the power of that name. The second, more terrifying theory, it was the name of an entity. When their god seemed to have abandoned them, perhaps they began to listen to the gods of the new land, the spirits of the trees and rivers that the natives worshipped. Croton may not have been a tribal name. but the name of an ancient native god, a spirit of life and death. Carving this god's name into their village would have been an act of blasphemy against the old world and an oath of allegiance to the new. They were not just assimilating physically, they were assimilating spiritually. They were giving up their old souls to be accepted by the new land. And the final, most abstract and disturbing hypothesis, crotone, is an alchemical term. One of the core principles of alchemy is solve et coagula, dissolve and condense. To create gold, or the philosopher's stone, one must first break down, dissolve the elements into their original chaotic state. Perhaps, faced with inevitable collapse, the most educated settlers decided to undertake one last social alchemical experiment. They chose to dissolve their colony into the wilderness, deliberately vanishing, in the hope that from that chaos, something new, another form of existence, would condense. In this scenario, they were not lost. They voluntarily vanished. In the end,